Good morning. It's Pop again. Dennis Murray. How are you? Okay, let me move this mic over where it belongs. Um, so today is Popcast 62, and it's called Nature's Wisdom, Part 12. I promised yesterday that I would tell a story about the movie called Avalon, um, because it's another example of how difficult change can be. Um, we want to make changes in our life at home, our life at work, and in the community, and in church, to reflect our newfound appreciation of how important we are to each other in order to thrive. Um, and, we've always known we were social, but the science has helped show us that we're a lot more social than we had thought, and that our way of living is profoundly different from that of other creatures, starting um, several million years ago when we began to live as bonded pairs in society, which no other species has been able to pull off because it requires a very sophisticated psychology to be able to do it. It's inherent conflicts. So, it leads us to be a species who extends um, a first step towards others in the hope that it will be reciprocated. And uh, so we're a species who live by hope. And it's an extremely important part of our entire psychology and of our success as a species. And so, with an increased appreciation of how important this hope is and the payoff that comes when it's reciprocated, so now we're sharing hope, and whatever the particular issue was between us has now become our issue, which we're working on together. Uh, So, with that in mind, we want to look around and see what changes there are to be made. And about changes, I'm, making the point of how hard they are in all the phases, homework and church and community, and for a lot of reasons. And we all kind of know this, but it's a good thing to stop and take, some note. And storytelling is as good a way as any to make the point, um, and uh, and then we'll uh, move on to other aspects of how you make changes and what kind of changes seem more um, tuned attuned to nature's wisdom. So those are the directions we'll go in coming days. Um, but so the movie Avalon. So I didn't look up who made it, but it's a famous filmmaker, and it's placed in Baltimore back in the mid '50s. It's a very very sweet story about some families. They were merchant families in Baltimore, and they were Jews, and then it has to be, that's part of the tradition that was involved in their families, and I gather in other families uh, in their circle. It was considered the tradition that the turkey was not cut until everyone was there at table. Now, to me, it's hard to appreciate why this would be a point. Uh, I've cooked lots and lots of turkeys in my lifetime, and we don't carve at the table in the first place. The turkey's too big, and there's too many people, and it's much easier. Sometimes we have to cook two turkeys because there's been so many of us. Um, So it's much easier to carve them in the kitchen. We get our best platters out and put the platters on the table with slices of turkey on it. But uh, you have to consider the tradition, the moment, the setting, and there's this one uh, brother of the father in this family who comes every year with his wife and children, and he never comes on time. And one year he's really outrageously late. I think it was more than an hour. And they're sitting there with the bird on the table waiting for this uncle to show up, and nobody can eat a thing, or, you don't start the meal until everyone's there. So finally, the father got up and started carving the turkey. And when the uncle arrives and sees that this precious tradition has been breached, a breach occurs between he and his brother and the two families that goes on for forever. Um, I honestly don't remember if they ever settled it in the movie. The movie that goes on to talk about the children and their businesses and the grandchildren and their issues, and it's a wonderful warm movie about family life. Um, but the point is that this simple change of carving the turkey before their brother got there caused a giant uh, split in the family that was just overwhelming and caused the just untold grief for people that loved each other. So traditions have to be considered when you're proposing change. And my kids and grandkids and I have been talking about this a lot lately about too much too soon. When you consider that much of the current divide has religious overtones because it's pretty connected to, on the one hand, a respect for science and intellectualism, uh, which on the other hand is viewed with suspicion as not including belief in God. And of course, the science and intellectualism group suspect that the other group believes in God in a way that makes them a threat to science. So the tradition has grown of renting asunder, our left and right sides in modern society. Um, there are people on both sides who have faith, people on both sides who have respect for science. But typically, the real split here is, on the one hand, an appreciation of God in us, and on the other hand, an appreciation of science and objectivity. And the two sides fear each other. In that context, much of social arrangements have to be seen as being charged with religious overtones. There was a need for our species, like all species, to procreate, to increase and multiply. Essentially, that's the definition of a successful species in biological terms. And in all human life until relatively recently, things were always measured. Oh, he's thriving. His flocks have increased. His crop yields have increased. The number of fields he has increased. His slaves have increased. His children have increased. His wives have increased. Think in biblical terms, um, in Old Testament terms. This was how thriving was measured. Um, More is better, and almost without limit. So there were rules that had religious overtones that really were grounded in biology, and there were rules like don't masturbate, um, you know, uh, have sex so that you can have babies, so we can continue to thrive as a species. Um, don't be in homosexual relationships because you should be having sex with male and female so we can have more babies. Now, you know, days have gone by and our attitudes have dramatically changed. But bear in mind, these kinds of discussions aren't merely intellectual discussions. They're deep in the bone and they're connected to religious traditions, the hardest and most difficult traditions, to be able to be at all objective about and to negotiate about. And as time has gone by, for example, concerning homosexuality, for the great part of us, I mean, at my age, we largely grew up making jokes about homosexuals and not knowing any. As the decades go by, you get to meet some. And in time, you develop some dear friendships with people that are just wonderful people who are also homosexual. And you just have to give it up for the most part. But it's much harder, even in that experience, if your religious tradition was very strictly against this, and you're deeply religious, it's a much harder conversation for you to have because it's much harder for you to reach inside and find these materials and deal with them. So, in dealing with tradition, never forget if it's tradition girded by ancient culture or ancient religion, you have to be respectful of how hard it will be for the other to even talk about change, much less agree to any. And we don't want to take a threatening step towards another. We want to take a kind and generous step, an offering step. It says, we have a dispute. Please allow me to, move my position closer to yours so that you'll see that I'm trying for us to reach, harmony here between us so that we can then deal with the problem together as a common problem. And we'll have a shared hope that we're able to deal with this problem somehow. So you can't begin your first step with a threat, with an insult. Oh, you're nuts. I can't believe you still think that old-fashioned crap. What's the matter with you? You crazy people, I've had about enough of your crap, and etc. And a lot of conversations in the head run that way. You may not say all those things to the other person, but it is not impossible to read them in your heart and mind from your face. And so if you, turn to other people with that kind of face on and start trying to figure out how to make, a generous step towards them, you're not going to get too far too quickly. Your face is belying, what you think you're about to do. And there's where we are. We're in the really hard place because we've gained a greater appreciation of ourselves and each other from science showing us how social we are. So it's a wonderful new appreciation to gain. But whenever you discover that you're better than you thought you were, different in a better way, in a way that's encouraging and hopeful, there is still the discouraging and difficult business of, well, what changes do I have to make? How many, sacred traditions do I have to alter? And how do I go about the business of bringing up, altering, things that are very difficult for people to hear me talking about? And that's where we are. And this movie Avalon was a good example of it. Now, I'm going to move away from that to business. So change in business. Well, if we're more of a gift to each other than we had appreciated, and you may remember from some weeks back, I talked about not only Adam Smith's idea about the division of labor and about the skill of the individual for seeing his best interest in how to manage his fields and how to manage his small manufacture. Um, but that beyond that, there's the whole question of greed and fear of failure. And so any arrangements in business have to take into account our fears. Just as tradition causes us to be afraid of changing tradition, so our responsibility can do the same thing. It can make us afraid of failing our responsibility. And it's not silly. There's no reason why we shouldn't be afraid. Um, it's normal to be afraid because our whole life is a dangerous balance of things that somewhat conflict with each other. We just get huge rewards for managing the balance, but it's tricky and it's easy to be afraid. And so you have to honor the fear. Uh, in the case of religious and traditions among the family, um, the fear is if we break tradition here, then we break it there, and now we have no traditions to live on, and a family without traditions, a religion without traditions, who wants that? Um, we talk about the slippery slope. Once you start changing things, God knows where you'll stop, etc. Those are true fears, and they're not foolish. They're real, and they need to be honored and dealt with. You remember I quoted Jung a couple of days ago about you can't change anything till you accept it. Meaning, if you want to deal with some of your fears, you got to start. It means a lot of things in a lot of cases. It was a very wise saying. Um, but in our particular moment, we're looking at this part of it. If you want to do something about your own fears of change, fears of loss of valuable traditions, fears of failing to meet your responsibility to provide for yourself and your family, then you have to acknowledge those fears. They're not foolish fears, they're real fears. They're for a good reason. You could fail to provide for your family. And if you do fail, you will feel dreadful. And it's a real problem. Um, so that naturally we think, well, gee, maybe a little greed's a good thing. So I'll overcharge the guy who doesn't seem to know how to protect his own interest in a transaction. I was a lawyer for 20 years. I had clients come in and say to me, here's my problem. How do you solve it? And, fundamentally, at an early stage in the conversation, I explained to them that I have to give you advice about how much money you should spend to pay me for advice. And you need to appreciate that if my reputation for being an honest lawyer and a good lawyer it hasn't come to your attention, you should leave. There's no way you can continue with me as your lawyer without trusting that I will be fair in deciding how much money you should spend paying for my time and advice. And I was, I worked very hard at that, but it's important. It's part of this whole business that we're talking about the delicate balance in society. You've got to make that step, a generous step. And in my case, being an honest lawyer is generous. It's required. You have nothing if you don't have integrity as a lawyer. Um, and but I also was more than a little bit generous, perhaps to a fault. My kids laugh and call me Dennis, charge me double, because I have been very blessed. And I'm very aware that the other guy may need a little bit more than I do. And I don't want him to cheat himself, trying too hard to be fair to me. He can, charge me, at a fair price and maybe give a deal to somebody else that needs it. So my kids laugh at me. It's part of my whole shtick in the family. Dennis charged me double. But, Gayle, on the other hand, while she was extremely generous with family and friends, was a real hard nose at work. In dealing with staff, she had a very strong idea about how one runs a good daycare. And she and her partner were a great one-two punch. Um, they both had pretty clear ideas about how you do things. And Gail was on the personnel side. And so, she succeeded in exuding confidence in how you do it. And she quickly found people that naturally figured out what to do next in the classroom on their own. And, she'd give occasional training. Um, that part she was just fabulous at being a good manager, not hard nosed, but nobody to fool with. If you didn't measure up, she knew pretty quickly that you had to be able to walk into a room and sit down and figure out what to do next, and without being told. Otherwise, you just don't have the instincts that you need to do the job well. Um, but that was fine. But the other side, she also dealt with a lot of the suppliers and, service suppliers, product suppliers. And, is she was just hard nosed. She had only her own interests in mind. She really didn't, she couldn't see the other fellow's point of view. And so she had no concern with whether or not he was getting a fair side of the deal. She just wanted to be damn sure she got the best side. And, I say our partner, Gail and her partner, Marge, formed the daycare business. The two husbands were part of the foursome that helped build the buildings and make things happen that were important in supporting the success. But so I say our partner, Marge, and her husband, Tom. Um, but really, I mean, the partnership at the heart of it was Gail and Marge. So, Marge told me many times that Gail saved thousands of dollars a year over the first offer from people by being a hard negotiator. And um, so, this whole thing about greed, fear of failure, uh, is complicated. Where's fairness lie? It's complicated. Marge, on the third hand, was so here me, I charge me double, Gail, a hard nose. Marge, on the other hand, we were doing so well, she felt morally guilty about how much we were making as owners. We, I say, Marge and Gail were making as owners um, compared to what we were paying the employees. So she proposed and Gail agreed to a huge increase in pay, which had a dramatic reduction in the bottom line to the owners. But it also, in the long run, had a wonderful effect that we were able to retain staff uh, because it was a really good paying job and really good work environment, with care and concern and knowledge, know-how on the part of the two owner managers. Um, so, maybe in the long run, it turned out to be a good move. But so here's three different ways of responding to, the whole thing in business and issues that involve greed and fear of failure. You could tell a million stories just to illustrate how difficult that is. Now, again, I had a lot more stories to talk about today, but I talked already enough about these stories. So more tomorrow. Take care. Bye bye. I won't say Happy 4th of July yet, and we'll save that for tomorrow. Bye bye.